As we learned in Module 1, a significant amount of an analyst's time is spent cleaning up data, getting it ready to actually do the analysis. One of the ways that speeds this process up, the process of cleaning data, is known as text to columns. Just as the name sounds, this is a function in Excel that takes a set of values that are combined in one column and splits them into multiple columns. It does this by splitting the data using what's known as a delimiter, and we'll get into a few examples of that in a minute. But you can think of a delimiter as an item that separates the values. So you may have heard of comma separated values, or CSV. In that case, a data set is separated by commas. So for example, you may have a name that is separated by a comma, or various other data fields that are separated by a comma. So why would you need to do this? Well, let's look at a couple real-world examples. So here I have a data set that looks like it could be used for some sort of marketing campaign or email campaign. We've got an ID, we've got a name, we've got an email address, we've got the gender of the individual, and we've got their location. And then lastly, we have their IP address. So this is all well and good, and it's likely very useful. But there's a few things that I noticed about this data set that text to columns can help us with. The first is if I come over to name here. One of the things that is helpful is to separate out first and last names. This can be used for a variety of different applications, but for the purposes of this data set, let's just say that we wanted to target specific last names or do an alphabetical split on the way we look at things, but we wanted to specifically focus on last names. So given the way the data is structured here, we have for the first name here, we have Streeter and then comma, the first name Dulincia. So, you know, that's all well and good, but that doesn't really help us for what we're trying to do here. So we need to separate the last name and the first name into two separate columns. So how are we going to do that? Well, I have here in the name column, in column B, what I'm going to do is use our shortcut to highlight the range that we want to select. So I am going to do Shift Control down arrow key, and then I'm going to do Control C to copy this, because I want to copy this. I want to leave the data that exists in column B. I want to keep the integrity of that data and just copy it to a different column. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and then hit Control and then hit the up arrow key, and that'll get us back up to the top, and I'm going to move over to column G, and I'm going to hit Control and then V to paste the data. Okay, now we have this in column G, and it's a brand new column full of that data from column B. So let's use our Shift Control down arrow key and move over to the data menu and scroll over to the middle here, and we can see that there is a text to columns button just to the left of remove duplicates. So I'm going to click that, and we're going to be presented with a wizard here. So it's going to give us two options. We can choose the file type that best describes your data. So there's two options here. One is delimited, which in this case we do have a delimited data set, because if you see here, we've got that column separating the two names. That's our delimiter in this case. The comma is the delimiter. Fixed width, it says fields are aligned in columns with spaces between each field. Now, 9 out of 10 times you're going to use the delimited description for your data here if you're using text to columns. So in the wizard here, this is step 1 of 3. So I'm just going to click next, and you'll notice that this screen lets you set the delimiters your data contains. We've already discussed that ours contains commas, right? So I want to uncheck tab here, and I want to come down to comma. There are several different options here: tab, semicolon, comma, space, and other. Other is like a special characters. Let's say you had a plus sign or some other delimiter in there that's not part of one of these options. You could use that in the other space here, and then plug it into this blank field here, this blank text field. So in our case, we know that we are going to choose a comma. You'll notice, let me uncheck that and then check it again, and pay attention to the data preview window down here. You'll see that there's our delimiter right there. and here's the first name, and here's the last name. So let's click the comma again and watch what happens. It's separated. All right, good. That's what we want. So that separation now has occurred, and we've got the last name in one column and the first name in the second column. Let's click next. Here we don't really need to do anything because our data is just generally formatted. It's not a date, it's not anything abstract or anything like that. It's just purely names. So we don't have to worry about anything specifically here. Let's click finish and see what happens. Okay, great. You'll see now that we have the first name in column H and the last name in column G. What I'm going to do is add headers here. I'm going to type in last name, and then I'm also going to type in first name here. And I'm going to do something here. I'm going to go to the home menu and I'm going to click the red font color. Now, this is just something I like to do personally. The reason for me choosing red here and putting these two items in a separate column and not deleting column B is because I want to keep the data integrity of these columns from A to F intact. I don't want to change anything here. I'd rather have the original data set intact and manipulate it in a way that is additive rather than decreasing the data set or removing any values. The way I like to show that I've added something or changed the data set is by making the headers red. It's just something I've learned over the past years, and I use it consistently whenever I'm doing an analysis. It just helps me remember that I've done something in the data set that wasn't in the original data set, and it also helps others if I pass this analysis along to them. So what I did was I basically highlighted column B and then pasted that into column G and then did a text to columns on that information to create two columns using the last and first name. So now I can do a sort on this, so I can come over here and I can highlight the section using our Control-Shift down arrow key. I could right click and I could go to sort and I could go from A to Z, and I'm going to again get that warning where I want to make sure that I expand the selection so I don't mess up my data set. I'm going to hit sort, and then you'll notice everything now is alphabetically by the last name, and I can go over to column B here and see that it did the exact same thing. It is now alphabetically from A to Z using the last name here. So what's nice about this is that because I left my data set intact, I could double check the integrity. So that's great. All right, let's do this one more time. I've noticed one more potential improvement to this data set, and that's with the location. You'll see that we also have a comma delimited value here in the location. We've got Washington, comma DC, which effectively is the city and then the state. But for our marketing campaign, we want to target certain states, but we want to make sure that we do that in a way that allows us to also retain the city integrity, but we want to have the states in a separate column. So what I'm going to do is come over to column E and do Shift Control down arrow key just to highlight that or select that range. I'm going to do Control C for copy. I'm going to move over to column I and I'm going to do Control V for paste. And then while my data set is still selected, I'm going to come up to data, click on text to columns, keep it as delimited, check on my comma. You'll notice that this is already selected because Excel knows that we've done this before. So likely we want to do it again. So next, and then I'm going to click finish. So you can see here now my states and my locations are in two separate columns. This is good. So let me label this city and let me label this state, and then I'm also going to make sure that I put this in red text so people know that I have changed this data set or added to it. Now what we can do is do various things with the state by itself. We can sort by state, we can create a pivot table and use this data to select certain states and use it as a filter. We can target certain last names in certain states using filters, as well as the pivot table functions or anything else that we'd like to do in this analysis. we cleaned up our data and made it a little bit more usable by using the text to columns function to separate the first and last name and the city and state, which were both comma delimited.